For 5 years, their faces were a constant ache, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Posters with smiling portraits of Sarah, Jessica, and Emily clung to telephone poles, their colors fading under the relentless sun of a Pennsylvania summer. They were a trinity of youth and potential, swallowed by the dense woods of the Delaware Water Gap. The last anyone saw of them was on a sun-drenched afternoon in August 2010. They were campers, 3 bright teenagers on a hiking trip, and they had simply vanished. No struggle, no sign, just a chilling, absolute silence that settled over the forest. The initial investigation had been a flurry of activity, a desperate scramble by law enforcement and hundreds of volunteers. Helicopters had crisscrossed the canopy, their rotors beating a frantic rhythm against the indifferent sky. Search dogs, their noses to the earth, had scoured every inch of the trail. The official theory, for a time, had been simple, if heartbreaking. A tragic accident, perhaps a fall, a misstep on a treacherous cliff, their bodies lost to a ravine. But as the weeks bled into months and the months into years, the certainty of that narrative began to erode. There was no trace of them, not a backpack, not a footprint, not a single shard of glass from a broken lens. The emptiness of the evidence was a puzzle in itself. It was as if the girls had not fallen, but had instead been erased. The case went cold, a file gathering dust in the back of a police station, a grief too heavy to bear for the families who were left to piece together a life in the absence of their children. The public moved on, the story becoming another forgotten tragedy in the endless cycle of news. But for the families, time was a cruel, unchanging landscape. Every birthday was a silent tribute, every holiday a reminder of the empty chair at the table. Their lives had become a monument to an unending loss. Then, on a Tuesday in October 2015, 5 years after the girls disappeared, a phone call came in. The number was blocked, the voice on the other end a distorted whisper. The call lasted less than a minute. The man, or whatever he was, gave a single coordinate. He said nothing else. He didn't claim responsibility, didn't demand a ransom, and didn't offer a single word of explanation. The voice was cold, disembodied, and terrifyingly precise. It was a fragment of a larger truth, a single brick in a wall of silence. The police, used to dead ends and cruel hoaxes, were wary. The call seemed too simple, too direct to be real. But something in the man's tone, the sheer lack of emotion, struck a chord. The coordinate led to a remote, rarely traveled section of the woods, miles from the original search area. It was a place so thick with foliage and so far from any trail that it was almost impossible to find without a guide. A team was dispatched, their skepticism a thick, tangible presence. As they followed the GPS, the woods grew darker, the silence more profound. They moved through an unkempt landscape of ancient trees and tangled underbrush, the light filtering through the canopy in thin, ghostly shafts. The air was cool and still, holding the damp scent of decay and damp earth. There was no sense of a path, only the unyielding push and pull of the forest. The GPS pinged, indicating they had arrived at the exact coordinate. There was nothing, just a small clearing, no more than 20 feet in diameter, filled with a dense, thorny bramble. The officers began to cut away the brush, a task made difficult by the thick, knotted growth. The sound of their machetes was the only disruption to the unnerving quiet. As they cleared the last of the undergrowth, they saw it. a glint of metal, half buried in the soil. It was the rusted, twisted frame of a small handheld radio antenna. It was a model commonly used by hikers and amateur radio enthusiasts. It was also the exact type of radio the girls had been carrying. A collective breath was held. The skepticism that had guided them here evaporated, replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty. They had not come for a hoax. They had come to the right place. The discovery of the antenna was the first crack in the wall of silence. It was a physical link to a past that had seemed irretrievably lost. It was a promise, but it was also a warning. The forest had held a secret for 5 years, and now it was beginning to yield. The emotional weight of the moment was immense. For the investigators, this was no longer just a cold case. It was a living, breathing crime scene. For the families, it was a confirmation of their worst fears. The girls had not simply wandered off. They had been somewhere, and they had left something behind. The narrative had shifted, violently and irrevocably. The story of a tragic accident was dead. The story of a deliberate, malicious act was just beginning. The silence of the forest was no longer a symbol of natural indifference. It was a conspirator, holding onto its secrets with a terrible, patient resolve. The search had begun anew, but this time the focus was sharper, the purpose more grim. The question was no longer where the girls were, but what had happened to them, and who had been responsible. The discovery was a chilling testament to the power of a single anonymous call, a single coordinate, and the enduring, horrifying truth that the past never truly dies. It simply waits in the dark, silent heart of the woods for someone to find it. The discovery of the antenna was the first tremor in a tectonic shift of the investigation. The police, their initial skepticism, replaced by a grim determination, cordoned off the area. The small clearing, once an unremarkable patch of forest, was now a sealed-off crime scene. A new team was brought in. Forensic specialists, archaeologists, and seasoned detectives who had dedicated their careers to the most elusive of cases. The ground itself became the primary witness. Every inch was meticulously surveyed, marked, and sifted. The work was slow, methodical, and emotionally draining. As they dug deeper, a new layer of the story began to emerge, each artifact a chilling sentence in a dark, untold narrative. The first significant find, hours after the antenna was located, was a small, tarnished silver pendant. It was a simple heart-shaped locket, and a faint engraving of the letter S could be made out on its surface. The mother of one of the missing girls, Sarah, had given her this locket for her 16th birthday. The family had held onto a hope, however faint, that the girls might have simply run away, or that a terrible but not malicious fate had befallen them. The sight of the locket, half buried in the dark earth, shattered that last vestige of hope. A single, silent tear from an investigator who recognized the item was all the confirmation anyone needed. The locket was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a fingerprint of a life cut short, a symbol of a promise that could never be fulfilled. The emotional weight was palpable, a heavy pull that settled over the entire operation. It was a direct, undeniable link to one of the girls, a cruel and undeniable testament to her last moments. The discovery of the locket shifted the focus from a search for the missing to an excavation of the dead. The methodical work continued. Over the next 2 days, the ground yielded more grim evidence. A small, waterlogged backpack was found, its straps rotted away, but its contents still faintly discernible. Inside, a well-worn copy of a young adult novel, a half-empty bag of trail mix, and a small, cracked digital camera. The memory card was damaged, but forensic experts worked tirelessly to salvage the data. The photographs they recovered were a devastating glimpse into the final hours of the girls' lives. The images were mundane, full of the innocent joy of a summer trip. Selfies in front of a waterfall, photos of sun-dappled trees, and one, taken just hours before they vanished, of the three girls laughing, their faces glowing with a simple, carefree happiness. The final image on the card was a blur of leaves and sky, as if the camera had been dropped in haste. It was a final horrifying exclamation point on a tragic sentence. The camera didn't tell them what happened, but it screamed what hadn't. There was no image of a fall, no evidence of a struggle. The camera's final blurry image was a snapshot of chaos, a brief moment of terror, and then a black screen. As the days wore on, the discoveries became more macabre. A single worn hiking boot, its laces still tied in a tight knot. A section of a torn rain jacket, its bright red color, a jarring contrast to the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. And then the final dreadful find, a small dark shape protruding from the soil. It was a bone. The anthropologists on site confirmed it was human. As they carefully excavated, a grim tableau was revealed. The remains of a single individual, partially buried, their body positioned in a way that suggested they had been laid there, not simply fallen. The skull showed signs of blunt force trauma. The revelation was a gut punch. This was not a tragic accident. It was murder. The finding of a single body, rather than all three, was a new, horrifying twist. What had happened to the other two girls? Were they somewhere else? Were their remains also buried in this vast, indifferent wilderness? The single grave was an open-ended question, a dark puzzle that had to be solved. The police now had a murder case on their hands, but they had no suspect, no motive, and a victim they could not yet definitively identify. The forest, once a vast expanse of natural beauty, was now a tomb. The anonymous call had not been a final act of confession. It had been an invitation to a crime scene, a grim unveiling. It was a calculated move, a piece of theater orchestrated by someone who knew exactly what they had done. The identity of the caller was the new central mystery, the phantom figure who had directed them to this place of horror. Who was he? And why had he waited 5 years to reveal this terrible truth? The discovery of the remains was not an ending, but a new, more sinister beginning. The hope for a simple, if tragic, explanation had been a comfort. Now all that remained was the chilling reality of a deliberate, violent act. The investigators, once weary from a cold case, were now energized by a renewed, dreadful purpose. The quest for truth had changed from a rescue mission to a hunt for a killer, and the forest, which had so long held its secrets, was now being forced to give them up, one horrifying piece at a time. The silence had been broken, but the story was far from over. It had just entered its darkest chapter. The forensic teams worked under the cool, watchful eye of the autumn sun, their movements precise and deliberate, as if they were performing a sacred ritual. The remains were carefully exhumed, a process that took over 2 days. The body was identified through dental records as belonging to Jessica, the youngest of the 3 girls. Her family had provided a detailed dental chart years ago, a document they had hoped would never be needed. The reality was a crushing blow. The discovery of Jessica's body and the evidence of foul play solidified the shift in the investigation. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a homicide, and the other two girls, Sarah and Emily, were now presumed to be victims of the same fate. The crime scene was expanded, the search grid radiating outwards from the initial burial site. Teams of officers, archaeologists, and forensic anthropologists fanned out, their eyes trained on the ground, searching for any disturbance, any clue, any sign that the earth held more secrets. The area was a vast, unforgiving expanse, and the task was daunting. But the stakes had never been higher. The anonymous caller was a ghost, a phantom who had offered a single breadcrumb in a dense, dark forest. The police had a new theory. The caller was either the killer himself or someone with direct knowledge of the crime. The motive behind the call was the new, terrifying question. Was it a fit of conscience, a twisted game, or something else entirely? As the days turned into a week, the search yielded more small, heartbreaking discoveries. Emily's watch, its face cracked and its hands frozen in time. A single worn leather glove confirmed to belong to Sarah. These were not just objects, they were fragments of lives, scattered in the woods like shattered glass. Each item was a silent scream, a testament to a final, desperate struggle. The narrative now being pieced together was one of a chase, a flight through the wilderness, and a final, brutal confrontation. The investigators' emotional detachment began to fray. They were not just dealing with a cold case file, they were walking in the final footsteps of 3 young girls. The emotional toll was immense. The families, who had held onto a thread of hope for 5 years, were now forced to confront the unvarnished truth. The grief was not an old ache, but a fresh, gaping wound. They had been living in a state of suspended animation, and the reality was now a devastating weight. The forensic analysis of Jessica's remains continued at the medical examiner's office. The preliminary report confirmed blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. The analysis also found traces of a specific type of soil on her clothes, a type that did not match the soil at the burial site. This was a critical piece of information. It meant the murder had not happened where her body was found. She had been killed elsewhere, and then transported and buried. This new fact added a chilling layer of premeditation and complexity to the crime. The killer had not acted in a moment of rage. They had planned this. The soil sample was the key. It was sent to a specialized lab for a detailed geological analysis. The hope was that the soil could be traced to a specific geographic location. This was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. While the forensic work was underway, a different kind of investigation began. Detectives started looking into the anonymous phone call. The call was untraceable, a burner phone used for a single brief moment of communication. But the voice itself held clues. The audio was distorted, but a trained ear could pick up on subtle nuances. A linguistic analysis was ordered, looking for patterns of speech, regional accents, or any other telltale signs. They were looking for a ghost, a voice in the dark. The investigation expanded, the focus moving from the remote woods to the human element. The initial police interviews from 5 years ago were re-examined. Who was in the area at the time? Who had a motive? The list was long and filled with dead ends. Now, with a new narrative, the detectives were looking for something different. They were looking for someone who had been overlooked, someone who had seemed unremarkable at the time, but who had now gained a terrifying significance. The anonymous call was a deliberate act of communication, a whisper that had shattered a 5-year-long silence. The caller was inviting them to a game, a grim scavenger hunt. The investigators had found the first prize, and now they had to find the rest. The discovery of Jessica's remains and the evidence of a planned, deliberate murder was a devastating truth. It was a narrative of pure evil, not of tragic coincidence. The forest, once a symbol of wild, untamed nature, was now a monument to human cruelty. The search for Sarah and Emily continued, a desperate, grim race against time. The hope that they were still alive had been extinguished. Now, the goal was to find their remains, to bring them home, and to find the monster who had taken their lives. The silence that had once defined the case was now filled with the echo of a single haunting question. Who was the man who had given them the coordinate? The answer, they knew, would unlock the full, horrific truth. The geological analysis of the soil found on Jessica's remains came back with a stunning and unexpected result. The soil, a unique mix of clay, loam, and trace minerals, was not native to the Delaware Water Gap. The lab had identified it as coming from a specific secluded area of the Appalachian Trail, approximately 80 miles away from the initial search area and 20 miles from where Jessica's body was found. This was a massive, game-changing revelation. It meant the killer had transported the girls' bodies, or at least Jessica's, a considerable distance. The original narrative of a localized crime was now completely upended. This was not a random act of violence by a local transient or a disturbed individual who had stumbled upon the girls. This was something far more deliberate, far more chilling. The killer had a connection to the Appalachian Trail. The search for Sarah and Emily shifted from the immediate vicinity of Jessica's grave to a new, vast, and terrifying landscape. Police began a meticulous, wide-scale search of the newly identified area. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but at least they now knew which haystack to look in. While the search was underway, a new line of inquiry began, focusing on the Appalachian Trail itself. Who lived along the trail? Who was known to be a recluse or an eccentric in that area? Who had been there 5 years ago? The list of potential suspects was long, but it had a new geographical focus. The detectives began to cross-reference the names of individuals who had been interviewed during the initial investigation and had any connection to the trail. One name, in particular, began to stand out. A man named Richard Cole. He had been an avid hiker and a part-time guide in the area for years. He had been interviewed briefly during the initial search, as he had been in the vicinity at the time of the girl's disappearance. He had an alibi that was, at the time, deemed sufficient. He was on a solo hiking trip, but now, with the new evidence of the soil and the geographical shift of the crime, his story was looked at with fresh, skeptical eyes. His alibi was a solo trip with no one to corroborate his location. The detectives also revisited the voice recording of the anonymous caller. A new, more sophisticated forensic analysis of the audio was performed. The analysis found faint traces of a background noise, a rhythmic, subtle hum that was difficult to place. A sound engineer on the team, a hobbyist with a passion for radio, recognized it. It was the faint, distinctive feedback hum of a high-power amateur radio receiver. This was a critical clue. It linked the caller to a specific hobby and a piece of equipment. Richard Cole was a well-known amateur radio enthusiast in his community. The coincidences were piling up. The police began to build a case against him, but they needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed a direct link, something that would tie him to the crime. A warrant was issued, and a team of detectives and forensic specialists descended on Cole's remote cabin, a small, unassuming structure nestled deep in the woods of the Appalachian Trail. The cabin was a hoarder's paradise, filled with stacks of old newspapers, tangled wires, and a vast collection of camping and hiking gear. But the detectives weren't interested in the clutter. They were interested in the soil, in the hidden things. The search was methodical. They took soil samples from his shoes, from the floor of his cabin, from the tires of his old pickup truck. They were looking for a match to the soil found on Jessica's remains. They also searched for any other physical evidence. In a locked shed behind the cabin, they found a collection of old, rusted hunting tools, axes, and shovels. On one of the shovels, a dark, faint stain could be seen. It was sent to the lab for analysis. The tension was palpable. This was their shot. They had to be right. They had to have found the right man. As the search of the cabin continued, a new, more profound discovery was made. Tucked away in a dusty corner of the shed, buried under a pile of old tarps, was a small, crudely made grave. A dog was brought in, and the animal's reaction was undeniable. The ground was carefully excavated, revealing not one, but two sets of human remains buried together in a single, shallow grave. The dental records confirmed it. The bodies were those of Sarah and Emily. The search was over. They had found them. The emotional relief was immense, but it was overshadowed by the horrifying reality of the scene. The manner of their deaths was the same as Jessica's, blunt force trauma. The timeline of the murders was now clearer. The girls had been killed at the Appalachian Trail site. Then the bodies had been brought back to Cole's property, where two had been buried, and one, for reasons that were still a terrifying mystery, had been moved 80 miles away and left with a radio antenna. The discovery was a final devastating blow. The families now had a finality, a grim certainty, but they also had a new, terrifying question. Why? Why had their daughters' lives ended in such a brutal, senseless way? The focus of the case had now shifted from the discovery of the victims to the hunt for the killer. The police had a name, a location, and a chilling collection of evidence. Now they needed to find Richard Cole, who had, it turned out, vanished from his cabin 2 days before the warrant was issued. The anonymous call, they now realized, had not been a confession. It had been a final act of a twisted game, a last horrifying clue from a man who knew he was running out of time. He had given them one victim, a taunting breadcrumb, and then disappeared into the vast wilderness he knew so well. The hunt was on, and this time it was for a man who knew the woods, a man who had made a tomb of the forest, and who was now a ghost in his own landscape. The news of the discovery of the girls' remains sent shockwaves through the quiet Pennsylvania community and across the nation. The narrative had shifted from a sad mystery to a full-blown manhunt for a suspected serial killer. Richard Cole, once an anonymous eccentric, was now the most wanted man in the country. The last sighting of him was on a security camera at a gas station where he had filled up his truck before disappearing. He had no known family, no close friends. He was a man who had lived on the fringes of society, and now he had slipped back into the shadows. The police knew that his knowledge of the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Appalachian Trail was his greatest asset. He could live off the grid for months, a ghost in the vast expanse of trees and rock. A massive search operation was launched. Helicopters, drones, and hundreds of law enforcement officers from multiple agencies were mobilized. They were not looking for a lost hiker. They were hunting for a predator. The public, horrified by the brutal truth of the case, flooded the police with tips. Some helpful, most not. The psychological profile of the killer was now at the forefront of the investigation. Why had he moved Jessica's body? Why had he buried her in a separate location? The leading theory was that it was a psychological tactic, a final, twisted game. By moving one of the bodies and leaving a single specific clue, the radio antenna, he had created a trail of breadcrumbs, a puzzle designed to be solved. He was an archivist of his own crimes, a collector of trophies, a man who wanted his work to be seen. He wanted the world to know what he had done, but on his own terms. The anonymous call was not a moment of regret. It was a moment of supreme arrogance. He had been testing them, waiting to see if they were smart enough to find what he had left behind. The hunt for Richard Cole was slow and painstaking. The forest was his ally. He knew every cave, every ridge, every hidden stream. He was a master of his environment, and he had used that knowledge to evade capture. The search teams found his old campsites, small, well-hidden clearings where he had likely lived and worked for years. They found remnants of his life, old tins of food, fire pits, and discarded hunting gear. But he was always one step ahead, a ghost in the woods. The forensic analysis of the shovel from his shed came back with a chilling result. The stains were indeed blood, and the DNA profile matched that of all three girls. This was the final, undeniable piece of physical evidence they needed. It tied him directly to the murders and the burial of the bodies. The case was now airtight, but the suspect was still at large. The search continued for weeks, then months, a relentless, grim pursuit. The emotional weight of the case weighed heavily on the investigators. They were haunted by the images of the girls' joyful faces on the recovered camera and by the grim reality of their final moments. The narrative of the case had become a personal one. They were no longer just solving a crime. They were seeking justice for 3 young lives that had been so senselessly stolen. The breakthrough came not from a massive search, but from a single observant individual. A local hunter, out for an early morning walk in a remote section of the woods, came across a crude shelter made of sticks and tarps. He saw a man inside, a thin, gaunt figure with a wild look in his eyes. The hunter, an avid follower of the news, recognized the face from the wanted posters. He quietly backed away and made a call. The police moved in with extreme caution. They knew Cole was likely armed and desperate. The confrontation was brief and final. He was found huddled in his makeshift shelter, an old rifle in his lap. He did not resist. He was tired, starved, and defeated. He had run out of time, and the wilderness he had once so masterfully navigated had finally turned on him. He was arrested without incident. In the back of the police car, he said nothing. He offered no confession, no explanation, no apology. His silence was as profound as the silence of the forest that had held his secret for so long. The capture of Richard Cole brought a sense of closure to a case that had haunted a community for 5 years. But it did not answer the most fundamental question: why? In the subsequent trial, he pleaded not guilty, and his defense painted him as an eccentric recluse who had been framed. But the mountain of evidence was insurmountable. The soil, the DNA, the confession of a man he had once confided in, who came forward only after seeing the news of his arrest. It was all too much. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 3 life terms. The case was closed, but the scars remained. The families of the girls had a finality, a name to attach to their grief, but they would forever be haunted by the what-ifs. The memory of the 3 girls, once lost to the vast indifference of the forest, was now tied forever to the terrible story of a man who had used the wilderness as his hunting ground. The silence that had once shrouded the case was now a testament to a horrific truth, and a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beyond the edge of the trail. The final act of this terrible drama was played out in the courtroom, a sterile institutional space that was a jarring contrast to the wild, untamed wilderness where the crimes had been committed. Richard Cole sat impassive, a ghost of a man who showed no emotion, no remorse. The prosecution laid out a meticulous, devastating case, a narrative built on 5 years of silence and a recent, frantic excavation of the truth. They detailed the discovery of the antenna, the heart-shaped locket, the broken camera with its final desperate photograph. They described the painstaking work of the forensic anthropologists and the grim reveal of Jessica's body, the blunt force trauma to her skull, a silent, damning accusation. The jury was shown the evidence piece by piece: the shovel with the rusted bloodstains, the soil that linked him to the Appalachian Trail, and the chilling, triumphant phone call that had started it all. The prosecutors presented a motive, not of passion or financial gain, but of a sick, twisted control. They argued that Cole had chosen the girls not for who they were, but for what they represented: innocence, youth, and freedom. He had, they said, sought to exert control over something he could not possess, to extinguish the very light he could not stand. The anonymous call was presented as the ultimate act of this control, a puppet master pulling the strings of the investigators, watching them dance to his tune. The defense argued that Cole was a misunderstood recluse, a victim of circumstance, and that the evidence was circumstantial. They pointed out the lack of eyewitnesses, the 5-year gap, and the fact that the anonymous call was untraceable. But their arguments were thin, easily dismantled by the sheer weight of the physical evidence. The jury was not swayed. The narrative of the case had moved beyond speculation and into the realm of cold, hard fact. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Guilty. The word echoed in the courtroom, a final, definitive declaration that justice had, at long last, been served. The reactions were muted, a collective exhale of relief and grief. There was no grand celebration, no sense of triumph, only a profound, heavy sense of finality. The families of the girls were there, their faces etched with a grief that would never truly heal. For them, the conviction of Richard Cole was not an ending, but a new beginning of a life they would have to learn to live without their daughters. The judge's sentencing was a quiet, solemn affair. He spoke of the lives lost, the innocence extinguished, and the darkness that had been unearthed in the Pennsylvania woods. He sentenced Richard Cole to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Cole's reaction was nothing. He simply looked straight ahead, his face a mask of stone. He was a man who had already retreated into a world of his own making, a world where the only people who existed were his victims, a world that was now his permanent prison. The case of the missing camp girls was officially closed. The story was told, and the pages were turned. But for the small community, the memory of the 3 young lives, so full of promise and so brutally cut short, would forever be a part of their landscape. The forest of the Delaware Water Gap was no longer a symbol of nature's beauty, but a silent witness to a terrible crime. The anonymous call, once a mysterious, terrifying whisper, was now understood for what it was: the final chilling act of a killer who had wanted his story to be told, and who had, in the end, orchestrated his own capture. The story of the girl's disappearance was not a mystery solved by a detective's brilliant deduction or a witness's testimony. It was a story of patience, of relentless dedication, and of the slow, methodical work of science and forensics. It was a testament to the fact that even the deepest, darkest secrets can eventually be brought to light. The narrative had come full circle, from the joyous beginning of a summer trip to the devastating end in a courtroom. The silence of the forest had finally been broken, but the silence of the grief remained, a constant, heavy presence. The final image of the case was not a jubilant one, but a somber one. The faces of 3 girls on a fading poster, their smiles a stark reminder of the youthful joy that was lost, and the haunting knowledge of what had happened in the woods, the darkness that had finally been revealed.